Thank you, Jason. And just to make it clear, I did not expose myself to Jason. So what I'm going to talk about is the New Zealand situation, pretty much from 1990 up to where we are now. And first I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me, and especially Kathy for actually doing the organisation to get me here. So, what the situation was in 1990, the decisions that we're facing, our farmers, and I'm predominantly going to focus on our crossbred or coarse wool farmers above 31 microns, because they're predominantly the ones that have made the change. The changes that were made, how the changes occurred, I'm going to touch on those and talk more about some of those this afternoon. And I'm going to touch on the potential next steps in terms of reproduction for the New Zealand flock as a whole, and just a quick comment on, I was asked to comment on, whether or not some of the Australian flock might want to move in that direction as well. So the New Zealand flock in 1990 was about 20% fine to mid-micron, about the other 80% was above 31 micron, or what we call strong wool. And these are the prices at the time and through to now. And if you look at that 1990 period, that bit in the red, you see for a period of time the black line, which is the strong wool, above 31 micron wool, had been pretty flat. And it was predicted to remain pretty flat. And as you can see, it is flat. And if we go through to this year's prices, which aren't on that graph, they're historically low for us. So our farmers had a few issues. I hope you can see this graph, but it was put together by the ANZ Bank in about 2011, and it's for strong wool again, 31 plus microns, and the bottom light blue line is the nominal price, or the price farmers had been receiving. The darker blue line, they did analysis based on the base value of 2009, 2010, and looked back at what was the real value of the wool they're getting, or the purchasing power of the dollar you're receiving. And you can see for coarse wool, it had pretty much been going down since 1950s. So our farmers at that stage, predominantly our strong wool farmers, were faced with the fact that the purchasing power of what they were selling was declining. And our sheep farms in New Zealand, our sheep and beef farms, are in 8 types or categories. They're based on location, topography, soil type, and pasture growing capability. So if you go from the top of that table to the bottom, that's the harshest farming conditions to the easier conditions at the bottom there. And you can see that at that time, on the vast majority of our farms there, wool was a significant part or proportion of income in comparison to sheep. Sheep includes the sale of lambs for someone else to finish, lambs sold straight to slaughter or cull use. And the rest of the income is beef or deer predominantly. So wool was a major part of our income, but in relative terms, the price of wool, especially for coarse or strong wool, was declining. The support the government had been giving to farmers through the 70s and early 80s had been removed, so there was less support for farmers, financial support, and costs were increasing. And a number of industry reviews were undertaken in that late 1980s through the 1990 periods. And probably the most famous one was the McKinsey report, which was an across-industry review and report, also involving government. And they came up with 3 conclusions. Basically, for the strong wool above 31 micron farmers, the best outlook for them was to focus on lamb production. For the mid-micron wool, which for us is 24 to 30 micron, the suggestion was they should either leave the industry or change the type of sheep they had, because the outlook for them wasn't great. The value of the wool was predicted to decline in real terms, and the type of sheep and the land they had wasn't really suited for lamb production. So they were suggested to move to either finer wool or to focus on lamb production, and for the finer end to focus on wool production. So therefore, farmers needed options, and there was either change to another farming system, and I'll show some figures that clearly show that lots of farmers left the industry, to diversify, or to focus on that fine wool or that lamb end of the production system. So these are the numbers of farms for those 8 farm classes in New Zealand in 1989-90. And I'm going to come back to that. If you look at the farm numbers now, you see in all farm types or categories, there's been a dramatic reduction in the number of farms based on the latest 2016-17 census data. And you can categorise those farms into two groups. The group in the red are our better quality farms, flatter farms, more fertile farms that grew more grass. That group are the group of farms where those farmers either sold out or changed enterprises. So the other group of farms where we see now dairy cattle production, horticulture, viticulture. That explains most of that reduction. In the top four classes of farms, which are the non-red group there, they are more hill country type farm, which limits their ability for some of those other farm classes. So the reduction we see there is a bit of forestry is going in, and there's another push with the government currently for more forestry, and also a lot of merging of farms. As farmers saw one way to be more cost effective is to become bigger. And I'll touch on that also in this figure here. I couldn't get a figure from 1990, but this is 2002 through to 2016, and it shows this reduction in farm numbers are occurring. So if you look at the red circle there, or oblong shape, that's sheep and beef farms. We see there's been a 28% reduction in the number of those farms between 2002 and 2016, but an 18% reduction in land area. So in other words, there's been both farms coming out of sheep and beef, but a larger number of also being through mergers. And you can see that the bit below there, we see there's been an increase in land in dairy cattle farming. I'm going to bring this graph up later on, but not surprisingly, if there's less farms and less land, there's a reduction in both sheep numbers and cattle numbers. And we're down to about 17 million breeding ewes at the moment. And I'll bring that graph up again later on. So there's been a dramatic decline. So our farmers were left with wool versus lamb income, and because at that stage 80% approximately of our flock were above 31 microns, the decision was mainly for them increasing lamb production. A lot of these type of graphs were and data was analysed through the 80s, through the 90s. This is actually from 2010, but it shows for 5 of the farm classes there's a clear relationship between EBIT, which is in New Zealand is income before interest and tax per hectare, and lambing percentage. Each of those points are different years and the quartiles for each of those 5 farming classes, but you see a positive relationship. Profitability increases with increased lambing percentage. Now, consultants were doing those type of analyses through the 1990s as well, and also at the various research organisations and universities, the farm management or business departments were also doing analysis too. And I was involved with one as well. And what we did is we looked at the profitability of increasing lambing percentage for a North Island hill country farm. Now, a North Island hill country farm, approximately 60% of what it consumes in a year is consumed by the sheep flock. So we capped that and said, okay, on the grass that's grown on that farm, a maximum of 60% can be consumed by the sheep flock. And then we looked at what would be the impact of increasing lambing percentage. Now, by increasing lambing percentage, we'd probably have to drop the numbers of ewes to maintain the same feed demand on the farm, and of course the individual lamb weaning weights would be slightly less. But as you can see, based on the values from 2004, and we published this in 2006, for a 65 kilo ewe, and this is dollars farm gross margin per hectare. The price of lamb was quite low at that stage, but if the principle is we went from 1.2 or 120% lambs weaned per ewe to the ram, you can see there was an exponential increase in profitability for farmers. And that message was coming through clearly from a number of groups through the 90s, early 2000s, and that was helping to drive change. Why is the multiple bearing ewe so efficient? In New Zealand, a stock unit is one 55 kilo ewe rearing one lamb consumes in a year. That total units are feed demand. And so I just quickly put this together. So if you assume you have 155 kilo ewe, she's weaning a 30 kilo lamb. In that year, that unit eats about 550 kilograms of dry matter. Now, in New Zealand, we're maybe a bit more fortunate than some environments. Our average pasture quality, or ME, is about 10.5. That's how you get that 550 kilograms of dry matter. But about 68% of what she eats in a year is just maintenance. This just keeps her alive. the only return you get in those maintenance calculations is for wool. If you're at the coarse wool end, which is only worth just over a couple of dollars a kilo, and it's costing you $4.20 to shear, you're actually getting nothing back for that maintenance in reality for many of our farmers at the moment. So the only income you get is based on the other 32% of what she eats. And that works out at about, of her total feed consumption, it's 18 kilograms of dry matter per kilogram of lamb weaned. If you do those same basic calculations but for a twin bearing ewe and you make some assumptions, I've just assumed here that she's rearing two 27 kilo lambs, which is applicable to what we see on many farms in New Zealand. She'll eat about 670 kilograms of dry matter. All of a sudden, the percentage of what she eats in a year that goes into maintenance drops down to 57%. But more importantly, per kilo of lamb weaned, she only eats 12.5 kilograms of dry matter. If you compare those two scenarios, the twin-bearing ewe is only consuming 20% more feed, her and her lamb, in that year as a unit, but that ewe is weaning 80% more kilos of lamb. So that's how you get that efficiency from that higher lambing percentage. Recently, the Irish, who get a lot of EU money, and they're getting more and more EU money because the English are leaving, they did a big study over 4 years and actual measured intakes of ewes and lambs and looked at different lambing percentages, and their figures with actual measured intakes, both indoors and outdoors, and right through to that lamb being slaughtered, showed the same value, that you're far more economic and far more efficient by having multiples. So it backs up those theoretical examples. So the messages were getting out there that it was far more efficient to have a multiple bearing ewe. Farmers were taking that on board. You had more lambs for sale as well. You had greater selection pressure because you had more animals to select from. So in theory, you should make faster genetic gain if you were trying to make genetic gain. You get greater utilisation of spring feed, and in New Zealand that's a big issue. We grow a significant amount of feed in that spring period, and the more a multiple bearing ewe consumes more of that. So you need to be consuming as much of that as possible, because that not only is cheap feed, but the more you consume, then it maintains quality through the summer autumn period, and you'll actually grow more grass. So having more demand on farm in spring is very important for the New Zealand farming situation and improved profitability. Now I've used the extremes here. I've used a picture of a triplet and a singleton bearing ewe, but just to show the triplet bearing ewe is even far more efficient. And this afternoon I'll talk more about the triplet bearing ewe. So, what's happened? If you can see there, those 8 farm classes, you can see for 5 of them, in 1989, we were about 90% lambing percentage, that's lambs weaned per ewe to the ram, or less. Now that's similar to other places I could think about. And the bottom 3 there are above 100%. If you look where we are now, we can see there's been a dramatic change in all farm classes. Now, what I didn't say earlier is because there's been a reduction in our flock now of the fine and mid-wool sheep, they probably only make up about 8% of our flock now. The merinos are around 4%. They've pretty much retreated now to the South Island High Country. So even in the South Island High Country, and I'll show another graph soon, with predominantly merinos, we've seen there's been an increase in lambing percentage as well. What is underestimated by those graphs, or that table, sorry, is that bottom group of 4 again in the red. The 1989-1990 figures include all farms. But I told you that the best half of them moved to other industries. So they were actually the ones that would have had the highest lambing percentage back then as well. So the change in that group is actually underestimated, because the ones we have left now in 2016 is actually the poorer half, probably, of those farms on average. So in all groups we've had quite a change in lambing percentage. And it continues to increase. And I thought I'd just show you some more recent figures and a better way of presenting the data. Unfortunately, beef and lamb only changed in 2009 to presenting distributions. Up till then it was just a mean, and a mean tells you nothing. A distribution tells you a lot more. So in 2009, this is the area I come from, North Island Hill Country. This was the average lambing percentage, and I hope you can see that down the back, but along the bottom axis is lambing percentage in 5 percentage point categories, and on the vertical axis is the percentage of farms. So what you see there is we have quite a distribution. So we do have some laggards as well, we would say, at the tail end. But you see, from 2009 to 2017, we've got that push to the right. We're still increasing in lambing percentage across the spectrum, but again, we still have that large distribution, and that tail end is a problem for us. And I'll touch on that again later on. I thought I might the other farm class I might show is the South Island High Country, where the merinos are. 2009, note the change in the scale of the vertical axis. It's no longer from 0 to 15%, it's 0 to 40%. So in 2009, 37% of those South Island Hill Country farms had lambing percentages of 80% or less. Now, if you go to now, hopefully you can see the vertical axis has changed. It's now no longer 0 to 40%, it's 0 to 15%. So now there's only 13% of farms in that category from 2009 to 2017 that actually are less than 80%. So on all farm classes, we're seeing continual gains in lambing percentage year on year. But of course, we also there have that distribution as well. I think the most impressive graph that our industry is most proud of is this next one, which encompasses both a change in new flock and a total flock, actually, from 1990 through to now, and also the change in total carcass that we sell. Our total sheep numbers have dropped 55%, but the total amount of carcass or hot carcass produced in New Zealand has only dropped 8%. So even though we've got less than half the flock, we're pretty much producing the same amount of meat. Now, that's a combination of increased reproductive performance, through increased lambing percentage of our mature ewes. We've got a bit more ewe lamb breeding going on, but what I haven't touched on also is that our carcass weights, we're trying to catch up to you on that. We were around that 14.5 kilos, now we're up to 19 kilos, and year on year, our carcass weights are increasing as well. So that's where our industry is heading. Higher carcass weights and continue to increase in those lambing percentage. If we now look at farm income, and I put this table up earlier on, remember pointing out the fact that a significant proportion of the farm income was coming from wool. On 6 of those 8 farm classes now, less than 10% of the income comes from wool. So wool is a very minor player on the income for most of our farms, but remembering that 90% of our farms are now above 31 microns in terms of our sheep, and lamb income is increasing in all categories, except for the very bottom category where a lot of cropping now goes on those farms. But in all those categories, you'll see there's an increase in lamb income, or sale of sheep income, which is predominantly through the sale of lamb. So there's been quite a shift in the emphasis on our farms, which therefore has shifted the thinking of our farmers and some of the decisions that those farmers make and how they manage their farms. So how have those changes occurred? Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'm going to briefly touch on a number of points, and I'm not really going to touch too much on the management guidelines that we give our farmers. That's more this afternoon, but I will just touch on them a bit, but more details this afternoon. Now, while the talk this afternoon is entitled about triplets, many of our guidelines are pretty much applicable for twins as well. So I'll be covering some of that as well this afternoon. So there's a rapid genetic change. Our sheep today are very different than they were in 1989, 1990. New breeds were coming into New Zealand in the late 80s, the Finn, the East Frisian, the Texel, just to name a few. And our farmers weren't really interested in going into straight bred animals or purebred animals of those breeds because of where they'd come from and their perceived hardiness or lack of hardiness. They were more used for produce composite animals to get a quick jump. So crossing with the East Frisian or the Finn to get a quick jump in reproductive performance. So through the 90s, it was very common for farmers to be buying half Finn, choose Romney, just to use an example, rams, to be putting over their Romney ewes, to use an example, and getting 3/4 Romney, 1/4 Finn, or a whole lot of composites. were produced and developed. And in fact, the latest survey that we did in 2015 suggested in New Zealand now we have over 150 breed types. Many of them are composites with some very strange names. And I think actually many of them are actually the same. But we've seen that. And now somewhere between 15 and 20% of our flock in New Zealand is based on these type of composites, which have a sniff of East Frisian, Finn, Texel, and other breeds through them. But that allowed for a quick jump. That allowed, within a generation, a quick jump in reproductive performance. And what it did is it kicked up the arse the traditional Romney, Perrindale and Coopworth breeders who had just been going along, going to shows, rubbing sheep and not actually doing anything, without offending many people, for a while, that they actually had to do something. We couldn't just produce a Romney that grew wool that was between their toes, covering their eyes, and that you couldn't sell. So the Romney and the Coopworth and the Perrindale today is totally different than it was back then. There was a real focus on reproductive traits. And to give credit to those breeds and their breed societies, rapid changes were made. As they realised if they wanted to survive and to maintain their breed and to be able to sell rams, they had to make change. So they did that, and of course they argued that they were doing that, but maintaining the other advantageous traits that have been put into those breed types over the previous 100 years in terms of their hardiness. But the sheep today are quite different than what we had then. A lot of research went on. Now, 60% of the variation in lambing percentage between farms is due to ovulation rate. So ovulation rate is the biggest driver in lambing percentage. But a lot of work had already been done in the 70s and 80s on lambing percentage, so there wasn't so much new work required to be done from 1990 onwards. It was more about making sure the messages were out there. Most of the research that had been going on was focusing on lamb deaths, what was causing lamb deaths, what are the risk factors that are associated with high mortality in our lambs. There's a lot on feeding, and I'm going to touch on that again, but a lot of research on where we had a different animal. We couldn't just treat her, the ewe, like she was when she was growing wool. A lot on focus feeding and improving feeding of the ewe post-weaning, so she went into breeding in better condition because these animals were genetically more fertile and fecund, so they needed that body reserve, and feeding her better in mid-pregnancy, late pregnancy and lactation. And a whole lot of management interventions were developed to improve lamb survival. And I'll touch definitely on those last 2 points this afternoon. A lot of tools, an uptake of use of tools in New Zealand. So body condition score, which I know is advocated a lot in Australia, is used. Pretty much any production trait, you follow this trend, where the optimal body condition score, as I'm sure you all know, is somewhere between 3 and 3.5. And as you get further away from that, there's a drop-off in performance. And above that, yes, you might get a small increase, but you could debate the efficiency of that. So there's a lot of work done in getting farmers to recognise the importance of body condition score. We didn't quite so much focus on whether a farmer knows that animals are 2, 2.5 or 3 or 2.75. I know you're far more accurate in Australia for some reason than us, and you have smaller categories. We more focused on, it's the 20%, the bottom 20% of your flock that's thin, that's costing you the money. They're performing at their bottom end. So all you really need to focus on is that bottom 20%. So if you're good enough to be able to tell which animal's in that bottom 20% in body condition score, that's probably all about the percentage of flock that you can actually focus on in terms of, afford to focus on in terms of feeding. So knowing that group and reassessing animals repeatedly during the year based on body condition to focus on that group. Pregnancy scanning is pretty much used by everyone in the industry. It's pretty hard to manage sheep if you don't know what's going on. And so if you're not pregnancy scanning, you're just doing that and hoping the wind will blow in the right direction. So we'd moved from early adopters just doing pregnancy to non-pregnancy through to now we have farmers, a significant proportion, well over 95% of farmers scan, and a significant proportion of those will be doing non-pregnant or dry, single, twin, triplet, and early versus late. Okay? Because that extra bit of not only knowing the triplets and being able to manage them, but early versus late allows you to make far more informed feeding decisions. The most efficient ewe is the one that rears her lambs. But you don't want to be feeding all ewes the same if they don't all have the same demand. You know, a late lambing ewe in New Zealand situation, when we're lambing in spring, doesn't need that feed for a bit later on. So why feed her the same as a ewe that's lambing first? The late lambing ewe, or the fat ewe, is never going to say to the thin ewe, you eat it, I don't need it. That doesn't happen. I've seen some of you guys at smorgasbord, that don't happen. So it's about targeted feeding, because it's the most efficient use of feed. And then using that, knowing the number of fetuses on board, her body condition score, and feeding based on that. And I'm not talking about having 10 or 15 mobs on your farm, I'm talking about having maybe 2 or 3 mobs on your farm, based on need, at any one time. And in New Zealand, we often talk about a truck and trailer approach, because we rotationally graze around paddocks for all the year except for during lactation, and maybe having those high demand animals first, getting the first pick, and those ewes that you're just really trying to maintain condition following up. And a good rule of thumb is you probably can only afford about 20% of animals in that the truck part rather than the trailer part of that. And I'll talk more about that this afternoon. And we've characterised the optimal feeding conditions in New Zealand based on pasture. It's not cost effective in New Zealand to use grains or concentrates based on grains, because the cost of the grains, our topography and our wetness, and being able to feed those out. So it's more about using herbages, and for each stage of the production cycle now we've got that quantified and very good guidelines. We also know that in very late pregnancy and in lactation, our triplet bearing ewes and many of our twin bearing ewes struggle to eat, physically consume enough to meet their requirement, and if they don't have any body condition score, which is why I always carry a bit more, because you never know when you need it, they struggle, they won't maximise performance. So there's been increased use of alternative herbages, or re-looking at some of the old herbages again, like lucerne, looking at the herbs, chicory, plantain and clover mixes as quality feeds in late pregnancy and lactation to really boost performance. And you get a significant increase in performance on those. And better outcomes for the ewe too. She'll end up in better condition, which improves the following year's performance. And so I'll touch on that a bit this afternoon as well. Of course, all that research had to be coupled with extension. And like Australia, we very much have a mixed model approach. Gone are the old days where you just read it in the rural press, or some boffin like myself stands up in front of you and we all pretend you're taking notice. There's far more different activities now going, a mix of activities, because farmers all learn in different ways. Everyone has a different preferred style of learning, and most people, if we're honest, need to hear it more than once and in different formats to really take that on board. So we've got that mixed approach, and we're actually moving more and more to smaller and smaller groups. So at the moment now we have what's called RMPP groups, which is groups of 8 farmers over 2 years working with a bunch of experts. So it's a very costly approach, but it's seen as the approach that'll give the most change. And you know, we need to be doing all these things, because those earlier graphs I showed you, we still have laggards or farmers who we just can't get up their driveways. We just can't get the change. But their neighbour might be performing at twice the level, so the potential is there. And also we increasingly know the importance of having farmers, good farmers of exemplars. Farmers will go away from a day like this and say, oh yes, that fella talked, but he spends a lot of time in the office. But if a farmer stood up here and said the same thing and said, I do these things and I make more money, you'll go, oh shit, I'll try that on. So using those exemplar farmers, those innovative farmers, is a very important tool to get the message across. Lessons learned, of course, I know New Zealand's close to perfect, but we're not quite perfect. We made mistakes. You need to couple basic research with applied research, on-farm demonstration. There was a push in the early 90s, just change the breeds, it'll work. Get the composites, that doesn't work. You know, it's like buying a Formula 1 car and putting it on a gravel road and say it'll go faster. You actually had to change the management. And the traditional breeds had to change. We'd have done a lot of improved feeding about knowing the needs of a more fertile fecund ewe if you're going to get the potential that she has inside her alive at weaning. A lot through the 90s, there's a lot of pushing of recipes. You do X, Y, and Z and you'll get outcome A, B, and C. Well, that doesn't work, because every environment's different, every farm system's different, and everyone has different breeds. So it's about tweaking. You know, it's a day like today, it's about taking in information and going home and thinking, actually that won't work on my farm, but if I just take this bit and that bit and just change it a bit, it will work. or I will get an improvement. So that's an important thing to take away from a day like today. It's not about just taking a photocopy home and doing exactly the same. It's about taking it home and adjusting for it to work in your system. And as I said, we use those farmer exemplars and those mixed models in terms of extension. Moving forward, what's likely to happen? If I just crystal ball gaze, this graph is that same graph from North Island Hill Country. We're getting those farmers at above 170%. That's a weaning percentage. So they're scanning close to 200 or above 200% once you're at that end. And those farmers are saying, if I just select for increased fertility and fecundity, I'm just selecting for more dead lambs. If an easy way to get an extra lamb is actually to breed my 8-month-old ewe lambs. And so we're seeing more of a push in that direction. For those farmers at the other end, or the left-hand side of the graph, I would say get that sorted first before you moved on ewe lamb breeding. But there is potential to increase the numbers of lambs weaned in New Zealand from ewe lamb breeding. And there's a whole lot of potential reasons why you might do that there. And I'm not going to go through those. But if you look at 2009 through to 2018, the black line at the bottom is the percentage of lambs in New Zealand weaned that come from ewe lambs. So in 2009, only 3% of the total lambs weaned in New Zealand come from ewe lambs. Now it's close to 7%. About the blue line there, 30% of our ewe lambs are bred each year. But the green line shows you in 2009, we're achieving 37% in ewe lambs, in those 30% of ewe lambs, but now we're at 67%. So the performance was pretty much doubled in 10 years in our ewe lambs. So there is potential there to get good lambs out of those ewe lambs. The other two things I think we'll focus on is not only will we continue to focus on lamb survival, but getting those lambs heavier at weaning. If I could crystal ball gaze, I would say the next influx of new genotypes coming into New Zealand is there seems to be at the moment a bit of a trendy phase for sheep milking in New Zealand. We're getting more and more sheep milking farms, and they're being very profitable. But what's happened is we've imported a whole lot of the sheep milking breeds from Europe. And I would suggest next year there will be a whole lot of composite rams for sale. Because those animals produce twice as much milk, and their lactation curve is not like a Romney or a Merino, which collapses after week 3 of lactation. It maintains. And the more milk you can get out of that ewe, the better the weaning weight. So I think we'll see that change coming through, improved feeding and lactation, and focus on growth post-weaning. And we're also seeing a change with many farmers are now focusing on reducing ewe wastage because we're getting higher ewe loss rates, probably associated with higher lambing percentages. So 2 last slides. It's a bit rude of me to stand up here and to say what I think the Australian industry could do. I'd be more happy to say that we're more likely to win the Rugby World Cup than you are. Cricket, well, I think we're probably lucky we played the bottom 3 teams first, but we'll see how we go. I showed you a graph earlier on that showed that farm profitability increased with the lambing percentage. Okay, that was a New Zealand graph. Now I'm going to show you a graph from Australia developed by an individual in the audience. So if there's any difficult questions, I'm sure he'll answer those. But this is from 2004 by Young et al. And this is for a merino wool enterprise, a terminal enterprise, and a maternal ewe enterprise. And it's the same 3 lines. Lambing percentage goes up, profitability goes up. So I'd suggest there is room for that, based on what that Australian report showed. They also showed where were the next big gains, for use of a better word, and I'm probably paraphrasing a bit here, and I hope I've got that close enough. But in that report, they looked at where are the 5 highest priority research areas, and in terms of potential return to the industry. And I've put the dollars there in potential annual return. And what they did was they said, well, this is what we're achieving now in the Australian industry. This is what research suggests that can occur, or what the potential is in Australia, and then looked at that difference and said, okay, if we could achieve that difference through improved research and extension, what would be worth on an annual basis to the total Australian sheep industry? And now, those 5 things are pretty much the same 5 things that I covered. And they pretty much all show that there is significant potential for increased gain in profitability on farms by improving reproductive performance in your flocks. So in conclusion, it was around the potential that our income of our farmers, the vast majority, especially that 80% or so in 1990 were coarse wool farmers, that their income, if they were going to stay in the industry, had to be coming from increased lamb income, and the only way you were going to do that was increase lambing percentage, and of course the associated, as I showed you, increase in lamb weaning weights. But this required new management systems to be developed, and it also required a change in thinking. And what I didn't say is also not only have we identified increased, or what the optimal feeding conditions are under ryegrass white clover, there's a lot more herbages planted on farms. And for some of those farm classes also we see there's a reduction in stock numbers as well. So because if you've got an animal that needs more feed, you either bring more feed in or you reduce stock numbers. So those two changes have occurred. And I'll touch on some of those management guidelines this afternoon. We've still got further improvements to be made. Not everything's fixed. We still have those laggards. We still have a lot of farms that can improve further, and we still have work to do at lamb survival. And as I said, there are new issues for us to address. And I would suggest finally that there are probably similar drivers on many Australian farms as there are in New Zealand sheep farms. Thank you.
I'll take one or two questions. That was awesome. Thanks, Paul. And you'd be pleased to know that Paul has an active role in a couple of our national research projects. We have a triplet project going at the moment. Paul's part of that. Ewe Lamb's one that's just getting going, and he's also going to contribute to that. And his thought is contributed to previous projects in the Twin area and that as well. So not sure if we can sneak in one or two quick questions. You'll have to keep the response brief, but we've got a question up the right-hand side here. And if Scott could come up the front in readiness for the next preso, I can't quite see him. Oh, he's just, hop up the front.
Is it likely that the increase in merino lamb percentages in the South Island high country relates a lot to the New Zealand ability to store water and build dams like Ben More and have productivity from what was just native tussock to lucerne and other changes there in the feed production?
Water storage is a big issue in New Zealand, and I wouldn't like to be recorded to saying as we're good at putting in dams or putting in more, because that'd get me in trouble. No, I think it's more about targeted feeding. Rather than, we used to talk about the 1980s and the 1970s with the skinny ewe days. You get subsidies in those days for having more animals, so you just have more animals. The government suggests we used to have 90 million sheep, but farmers used to just, move their neighbours' sheep over and get them counted as well and got more subsidy. We probably only had 70 million because we were quite smart. I think it's just more about feeding. And if you look at some of the merino flocks now, when they're making their selection objectives in those multiple traits, they are putting emphasis on reproduction as well.
Yep. Christy.
Thanks very much for your talk, Paul. I really enjoyed it. You talked a lot about increasing lamb weaning percentages, but what about lamb survival? Because as Jason and everybody else in the room knows, it's one thing to conceive a lot of lambs and mark them, but what's the wastage that you're seeing, and has that improved?
Definitely improved in singletons and twins. Singletons were around that 7 to 9% loss rates. Twins, most farmers are between, some farmers will tell you they're between 12 and 20, but it's probably between 15 and 20. Triplets are still a problem, and the average flock with their mobs of triplets, so you've got potential of 300%. Most people are tailing or marking in those paddocks somewhere between 180 and 220.
Yep.
But there's clearly still room for improvement. Yep.
You got a quick one, Cube?
No, I just got another mic over this side of the room.
All right, there's no one really waving at me, so we need to move on. Thanks very much, Paul. He's here to contribute this afternoon, and he'll be here throughout the day, so thanks for your contribution to our industry.